In order to take our basic primitive polygon objects that we find underneath the Create tab, polygon primitives, and turn them into something more unique or interesting, like this character on the right, we need to edit their components. Each type of 3D object has its own unique components. So a curve might have different components than a polygon model, but we're going to be focusing just on polygon objects for now. A polygon object's components are going to be a vertex, a face, or an edge. So these are the different components that make up a more complicated geometric object. So in order to change to those different component modes, I can select my mesh, and I can hold the right mouse button on top of my mesh, and I have here a radial menu that's going to show me different selections for different types of components. The ones we're going to focus on are edge, vertex, and face. Right now, we are actually currently in object mode. So I hold right click, we're in object mode right there. Object mode means that any of these transform tools I use are going to manipulate the entire object. All the vertices, all the faces, all the edges. If I want to move and manipulate individual components, I need to switch to a different component mode. So I'll go ahead and go to something like face mode. So now I can actually select and use those transform tools on that individual component. If I ever want to switch back to object mode and leave editing a single object, I can just hold right click and switch back to object mode, and now I'm no longer manipulating my different components. When we start editing our objects, it's good to get used to certain quick selection or shortcuts for selecting really complex geometry. There's a couple options and shortcuts I'll show you guys. It's by no means comprehensive, and you'll pick up new ones as you go along and learn Maya, but I'm going to try to cover some of the more frequently used ones. So the first thing is I'm using my select tool, and I can just select things, the components, just like I select objects in object mode. So I can left click on something and select it. You'll see it's highlighted. Hold shift to select something else. Hold shift to select something else. Hold control or shift to toggle or unselect something as well. I can also use marquee select, right, which is the click and drag. See, I can click and drag and I'll get all of those vertices. And like I mentioned in the select video, for selecting objects, if I don't want to select everything on both sides with that marquee select, I can open my tool settings and under marquee selection, change that to camera-based selection. So now you'll see when I click and drag, it's not going to select the vertices on the opposite side. Personally, I like to keep it off, and that's just me. We can actually do some pretty cool quick selections for selecting multiple components really fast. I'm going to switch over to edge mode, so holding right click to bring up this radial menu and going up to edge mode. Okay. And what happens is if you have an edge loop or an edge that multiple edges that are connected together end to end, then you can actually select them really quickly by just double clicking on the edge. So you'll see when I double click on this edge, every edge that is touching end to end with that and going in a straight line are going to connect all the way around, or they're just going to keep going until it encounters a problem area. Let's go ahead and create a problem area or an area that will interrupt our edge loop. I'm going to use the target weld tool. I'm just going to combine this together. Now I'm going to select and double click on this edge, right? You'll see when it gets to this area right here, it doesn't know where to go. Let me go ahead and make this a little bit more obvious. I'm just going to combine these guys together down to here. So I'll double click. You'll see when I double click on this edge loop now, there's certain juncture points when it's trying to decide where to continue an edge loop that it will get confused on and it won't make a decision for you. So typically you'll notice that if there is a cross section of 4 edges, right? So just like the simple cross section of 4 faces that are touching a single corner or sharing 2 sides across, that edge loop has no problem continuing on to the next step. But if that intersection has less than 4 or more than 4, so in this case we have 5, it will be interrupted and it won't go any further. And that's just the algorithm that the edge loop selection is using to determine what is considered a continuous edge loop. So this is considered a partial edge loop. A continuous edge loop goes all the way around and touches back on itself. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to use this double click to select an edge loop, that the topology in these intersections, the number of edges that are meeting there, will change your ability to select an edge loop, or what is considered part of an edge loop. I don't need to select the entire edge loop as well, but I can select multiple edges in a line. So I can select this edge, and I can come over here, and I can, or let's do it right here. I'm going to hold Shift and double click. So normally double click will select the whole edge loop. If I select this and hold Shift double click on another edge, it'll select all the edges between that first and ending, the starting and ending point. You'll see it's not selecting everything. It's just giving me a smaller selection or a very specific selection within that edge loop. This also works and can be applied to faces and vertices as well. Let's go to vertex mode. So normally if I double click on a vertex, it's going to select everything, right? Because with a vertex, it doesn't have a particular direction in mind, right? Because it can go in all kinds of different directions. And so when you double click by default, it's actually going to select your entire mesh's vertices. But we can come in a single direction, and I can go ahead and select that vertex and hold Shift and double click right here. You'll see it actually selects those vertices going in that direction in between. Just like when I went to edge mode and select a first edge and an end edge and double clicked on it, it went ahead and completed in between. We can get this auto edge loop completing by just double clicking. With vertices as well, we just have to make a small little tweak to it. So if I select a vertex and I shift double click on a vertex to the right of it, above it, or to the left of it, or below it, either direction, it will actually go along the edge loop in that direction and select all the vertices in that edge loop. So you see when I click, if I select this first starting point and shift double click on a vertex just to the right or just next to it, it will select all vertices in that direction. So like I said, if you just double click on it, it doesn't know which direction to go in, but if you select a vertex and hold Shift and double click on another vertex that's next to it, it will actually know which direction you want to go in. These vertex rules also apply to polygons. So if I come to face mode and I double click on my mesh, it's going to select all the polygons because again, just like vertices, it doesn't know which direction to go in. But I can select a face and hold Shift, double click the face that's right next to it, and it will know a direction now and it will create what's called a poly loop or a face loop. And just like with edge and vertice, I can select a starting point and hold Shift and double click on an endpoint, and it will only select the faces between that starting and endpoint. We also have this really handy tool underneath the selection menu for selecting components. I'm going to tear this off by going to select and click on this double dotted line. And I'm also going to come into vertex edit mode and just select a single vertex. And this is the grow and shrink option. When you click on grow, what's going to do is it's going to take your adjacent components to your current selection, and it is going to grab and include those in your current selection. So you can see everything that's adjacent to my current vertex selection, it's going to expand out and grab them. So it's going to go in this direction, this direction, this direction, etc., etc. Right? I can grow that out. I can use shrink to do the opposite. So it's going to take the outermost boundaries and shrink it in and remove those from the selection. So you can see I'm going to shrink them down. We can also grow along the loop. So if I go ahead and start a loop selection or a direction for my current selection, so I selected this one and selected an adjacent component to start a direction and click on grow. Grow along loop. You'll see it's going to go in that direction and try to grow. And it's having a problem right here for some reason. Let's try with faces. I'll select this, shift select this one, and we're just going to go ahead and grow along loop. And you'll see it's going to keep going in that direction and keep adding to the selection. And we can do the same thing, shrink along loop. So this can really speed up selecting multiple or large amounts of components really quickly. We're going to show a few practical demonstrations of this on a more complicated mesh. So I'm going to select my mesh. I'm going to go to vertex mode. Actually, yeah, let's go to vertex mode. So so let me demonstrate some practical examples on a little bit more of a complex mesh. So I'm going to select my mesh and I'm going to go to edge mode. So as always, I can start selecting by things just like with the normal selection process by left clicking on a current component to select it. If I want to add more, I can press Shift and click on those components. I can marquee select to select multiple components. I can do the edge loop selection by double clicking on an edge, and it'll select all the continuous edges that are connecting end to end with that edge that I had selected. Also, if I have any sort of intersection or vertice in that selection that is not 4. So you can see these have, this intersection right here has 4 edges connected to it, this one too, and so it knows which direction to go with my edge selection. But when it gets to here, this now has 5, and so it's interrupted. I can do the same thing with faces. So I'm going to select the poly loop or the face loop that goes around the mouth right here, starting with this one. And because I don't have a particular direction by default with a face and a vertice, unlike an edge, like it can go either left or right or up and down, I'm going to have to start a direction. So I select my first face, hold shift, and double click on a face next to it. And it knows now a direction it needs to go in to select that entire poly loop. I can also select only part of that poly loop or edge loop or vertex loop by selecting the first starting point and selecting the end point in that same loop and double clicking on it, and it selects all of those faces that are in between it. And I can do the same thing with vertex mode, of course, as well. So let's go ahead and select the entire loop. I'm going to go ahead and choose a first vertex, shift double click on an adjacent vertex. Now I'll select the whole loop, or I can choose a starting point and find a vertex on the same loop and double click on that, and it's going to select everything that's in between. Let's go ahead and I'm going to select my faces around this eyelid, right? So I'm just selecting these edge faces that are right around the eyelid, and I'm going to grow it out because I want to, for some reason, select all of these faces around the eyelid. That could be really tedious if I was using just normal selection methods, right? So if I just want to manually add all of these to my selection, this can get really tedious and be really difficult. It's a little bit too complex of a shape for me to do marquee selection, right? Because then I have to go in and edit and clean this up. I could go in, of course, and I can just hold shift, double click to get my poly loop selection and just do the same thing and keep going around. So shift start one, shift double click to adjacent one to select the whole poly loop, shift start a new loop, shift double click an adjacent one to go in that direction. I could also select a single one of these, right? So I'm going to go select a single face, hold shift, double click an adjacent one to select the whole loop, and I can go up to select grow, and I can expand that. So select grow. And there you go. Now I have a really quick selection of that eyelid right there. One other selection tool I like to use is the paint selection tool. You can find that with this little paintbrush icon right here. The way it works is it lets me paint over a selection, and instead of having to click on the individual faces, I can actually come in here and paint over them, and anything that falls inside this brush radius is added to my selection. I can hold Control to remove things, just like I can with normal selection. Another shortcut I like to use is if I'm just in normal select mode with the select tool, I can hold tab, and this is doing kind of like a mini paintbrush. And this one is actually I probably use more frequently than the actual paintbrush tool. And so I'll come in here and I'll just click on geometry, and you'll see it goes ahead and adds anything that I hover my mouse over. So this is another way that you can quickly and easily select multiple components really, really fast. In summary, if we want to take our very basic primitive objects that we've created and make them into more complex and unique objects, we need to manipulate their components. Each 3D object has their own type of components. For polygon objects, which we're going to be focusing on, those components are vertices or vertex, edges, and faces. I can use certain shortcuts to select really complicated selection sets. So if I want to select vertices and a complete line all the way around, instead of having to hold shift and click them each time, I can just select the first starting point, hold shift, double click on the adjacent point, and it'll select the vertices and an edge loop all the way around. I can do this with edge mode by just double clicking on the edge to select all the connecting edges. I can do that in face mode by the same way with vertices. Select the first point, hold shift, double click on an adjacent one to select all the faces in that direction. Once I'm done editing my components, so let's come here and I'll select this. I'll go ahead and scale it up. Say that was good for the day. I'm done editing my object. I can switch back to object mode and leave component editing mode by holding right click on my mesh and selecting object mode. Now I'm no longer editing it, and I am done manipulating that object.